The HOA president called the cops on my lakeside cabin. Didn't know I owned the dock that keeps her $1 million McMansion from becoming worthless swampland. Picture this. I'm sipping coffee on my weathered porch when Karen storms across my property in white designer yoga pants, trailing a very annoyed police officer. She's jabbing her manicured finger at my solar panels, shrieking about illegal eyesores and code violations. The cops taking notes while Karen practically vibrates with self-righteous fury. Here's what made me nearly choke on my coffee. She's standing on the very dock I can legally shut down tomorrow, which would turn her waterfront palace into a $900,000 paperweight. Before I reveal how this nuclear-level backfire cost her everything and got her charged with felony fraud, tell me, what would you do if some power-hungry neighbor sicked the law on your family property? And drop your state below. I'm betting half of you have dealt with this exact Karen. Trust me, this revenge was 20 years in the making. My name's Jake Millfield, and before Karen made the worst decision of her real estate career, I was just a guy trying to honor my grandfather's memory. I'm 52, retired Navy engineer turned handyman who inherited Grandpa's 1940s fishing cabin on Crystal Lake, Minnesota 3 years ago. Nothing fancy, just weathered cedar shingles and a screened porch where he taught me carpentry with that particular smell of pine sap and old wood stain that takes you back 30 years. Every weekend, I'd drive up from Minneapolis to restore what time had damaged, sanding railings until my hands were raw, replacing dock planks that groaned under bare feet. The morning mist rolling off the water while I worked was the closest thing to peace I'd found since retiring from the Navy. Then Brenda Weatherby moved in 200 yards away and turned my sanctuary into a battlefield. Karen, that's what everyone called her, was a 48-year-old real estate agent who'd fled Minneapolis suburbia for authentic lakeside living. She bought the biggest lot, built the whitest McMansion, and immediately started treating Crystal Lake like her personal country club. Picture the contrast. My wildflower meadow versus her golf course lawn, my beat-up canoe versus her gleaming motorboat that sounded like a jet engine at 6 a.m., my handmade birdhouses versus her security cameras pointed at everyone else's property like she was running surveillance. The trouble started when I installed solar panels on my cabin roof, completely legal, fully permitted through county, licensed electrician, the works. I was actually proud of going green like Grandpa would have wanted. Karen stomped over in designer flip-flops the day after installation, announcing like I'd asked her opinion. Those panels are an eyesore. They're lowering property values and violating HOA architectural guidelines. I showed her my county permits, explained politely that my cabin predates the HOA by 60 years, and declined her demands. That's when her eyes went cold, and she said, "We'll see about that." 2 weeks later, the county called. Someone had filed a complaint claiming unpermitted electrical work and fire hazards. Dale, the inspector, spent an hour checking every connection before shaking his head. "Everything's perfect, Jake. Whoever called this in was being frivolous." But Karen wasn't done. She'd patrol the lake in her motorboat taking photos of my property, corner neighbors at the marina whispering about how my hillbilly modifications were bringing down the whole community. Most folks kept quiet because these were retirees who'd worked their whole lives for lakefront peace, and Karen controlled the HOA like her personal fiefdom. Cross her, and suddenly your deck needs architectural review or your landscaping violates native plant requirements. I started noticing her pattern, though, how she'd show up whenever elderly neighbors were outside with her clipboard ready, mentioning comparable sales and market downturns every chance she got, how her real estate signs kept popping up around the lake after these conversations. One evening, while replacing a loose dockboard, the smell of creosote and lake water triggering memories, I found myself thinking about what Grandpa used to say. "Jake, sometimes folks don't know what they don't know, and sometimes that ignorance is expensive." He'd been more than just a fisherman with a cabin. He'd sold half the lots around Crystal Lake back in the 60s, but Karen never bothered asking about the old man's business dealings. She just assumed I was some working-class guy she could intimidate into compliance through her HOA presidency and real estate connections. She was about to learn that assumptions can cost you everything, and that the quiet guy fixing his dock might own a lot more than she bargained for. Karen's second attack hit my mailbox 3 weeks later. An official letter from the state environmental agency claiming my dock was damaging protected wetlands. Anonymous tip, of course. I'm sipping my morning coffee, reading about potential 5-figure fines and dock removal, thinking this woman has some serious nerve accusing me of environmental damage while her motorboat sounds like a chainsaw every morning at dawn. Pete Carlson, my lawyer, cut straight to the point. This is harassment, Jake, but we can't ignore it. State environmental violations carry real teeth. So there I was, a guy who'd spent 20 years serving his country, forced to hire legal help at $300 an hour to prove my grandfather's 70-year-old dock wasn't destroying fish habitat. The irony tasted worse than gas station coffee. The state inspector, Sarah, arrived Tuesday morning with enough testing equipment to analyze Mars. Professional, no nonsense. Clearly annoyed at having her time wasted on what smelled like a spite complaint. She spent 3 hours around my dock. Water quality tests, structure measurements, neighbor interviews. I watched from my porch, listening to her boots crunch across my gravel while Karen lurked behind her designer curtains, probably live streaming the environmental investigation to her yoga mom friends. Here's where karma decided to throw Karen a curveball that would make a major league pitcher jealous. While Sarah was testing water quality around my perfectly legal dock, she discovered something absolutely delicious. Karen's own dock extended 15 feet beyond legal limits into protected shallow water spawning areas. Not only was Princess Brenda actually violating the exact environmental regulations she'd accused me of breaking, but her illegal dock was actively damaging the fish habitat she claimed to be protecting. I nearly choked on my coffee watching Sarah march over to Karen's McMansion with her measuring tape and violation notices. Karen came prancing out in white capri pants, all confident smiles, and I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding, until Sarah started explaining how her dock was illegally built in protected wetlands. You could practically hear Karen's brain short-circuiting as she realized her environmental complaint had just boomeranged back into her own face. But it was professionally installed, Karen sputtered, waving some folder like it contained state secrets. The previous owner approved everything. Sarah just smiled, that patient smile government inspectors use when dealing with entitled citizens who think rules don't apply to them. Professional installation doesn't matter if you're violating current environmental codes, and previous owner approval is about as legally meaningful as a grocery list when you're talking protected spawning grounds. That's when I decided to twist the knife a little. I walked over with my grandfather's original 1952 dock permit, complete with survey boundaries marked in faded blue ink. Here's the legal documentation for my dock, I told Sarah, loud enough for Karen to hear. Grandfathered in for 70 years, never modified, completely compliant. I remembered Pete explaining this to me when we first met, how older structures often maintain their original permits indefinitely, while new construction has to jump through modern regulatory hoops. It was one of those legal quirks that could save your skin if you knew about it. Sarah's verdict was poetry in motion. My dock, completely cleared, officially compliant, case closed. Karen's dock, illegal, environmentally damaging, 60 days to remove the violation or face state fines. The smell of Karen's panic mixed with her expensive perfume as she stood there calculating how much legal dock reconstruction would cost her precious property values. But here's what really made my day. Neighbors started appearing in their windows and yards, no longer hiding from Karen's intimidation campaign. Martha, the retired teacher, actually waved from her kitchen. Frank, the old veteran, gave me a thumbs up from his boat slip. These folks had been walking on eggshells around Hurricane Karen for 2 years, and watching her environmental complaint explode in her face was like watching the school bully get detention. That evening found me back at the county records office, fluorescent lights flickering over stacks of property documents and survey maps. Something about Karen's confidence bothered me. Real estate agents don't waste time on harassment campaigns unless there's profit involved. The more I dug through HOA formation papers and easement agreements, the more questions I had about marina rights and property boundaries that nobody seemed to understand. I'd started developing a theory that Karen's attacks weren't random harassment, but calculated moves to pressure me into selling. The pattern was too organized, too persistent for simple neighbor disputes. She was working an angle, and whatever it was, she clearly believed she had legal backing for her campaign. Karen had warned me about bigger guns, but she had no idea I was quietly building an artillery depot of my own. Every night she walked across my dock without permission, those designer heels clicking on wood my grandfather had paid for. She was trespassing on property she didn't begin to comprehend. The sound was starting to feel like a countdown timer on her own destruction. Karen's third attack came through her HOA lawyer 2 weeks later, a cease and desist letter claiming my cabin rental violated residential-only covenants. I stared at the legal letterhead over my morning eggs, completely baffled. Rental? I'd never advertised anything, never charged anyone a dime. All I did was let my old Navy buddies crash at the cabin some weekends, and they'd chip in for groceries and beer. The letter demanded $500 per day in fines, retroactive 6 months, for illegal commercial activity. I'm doing the math in my head. $90,000 in potential fines would force me to sell the cabin just to avoid bankruptcy. Karen wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was going for my financial throat with surgical precision. Pete reviewed the cease and desist with the enthusiasm of someone examining a parking ticket. "Jake, this is legally weak, but defending it costs money. They're betting you can't afford to fight." The smell of his coffee mixing with old law books in his office reminded me of the county records room, both places where Karen's overconfidence was about to become very expensive. Here's where my Navy training kicked in. When someone launches an attack, you don't just defend, you gather intelligence on their own vulnerabilities. So while Karen was threatening me with rental violations, I decided to take a closer look at her property activities. What I discovered was absolutely golden. Princess Brenda was running an unlicensed Airbnb operation out of her finished basement, charging $150 per night for what she advertised as luxury lakefront accommodations. I'm talking full commercial operation, professional photos, online booking calendar, guest reviews, the works. She even had a separate entrance and kitchenette installed without permits. While she was demanding fines for my buddies occasionally crashing on my couch, she was literally running a hotel business in violation of the exact same covenants she claimed I was breaking. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Karen had been standing in her glass house, chucking boulders at my cabin, completely forgetting about the commercial enterprise humming away in her own basement. I spent a pleasant Tuesday afternoon documenting her Airbnb listing, photographing the commercial signage she'd posted, and reviewing guest testimonials that specifically mentioned Brenda's lakefront rental business. Armed with evidence of Karen's actual commercial violations, I filed my own complaint with the county zoning board. Unlike Karen's harassment campaigns, my complaint included photos, screenshots, booking confirmations, and documented revenue streams. I even found reviews where guests complained about Karen's strict house rules and inflexible cancellation policies. Hardly the behavior of someone hosting family friends, as she later claimed. Karen's response was panic dressed up as indignation. She immediately updated her Airbnb listing to claim the basement rental was for family friends only, despite having 47 public reviews and a 5-star rating system. She even tried arguing that her commercial operation was different because it was professionally managed and properly marketed, apparently not realizing that professional management made it more commercial, not less. I remembered something Pete had mentioned during our first meeting about HOA enforcement, how selective application of rules could actually invalidate the entire covenant system. If an HOA only enforces rules against certain residents while ignoring identical violations by board members, the courts tend to throw out the whole enforcement mechanism. Karen was essentially dismantling her own legal authority with every hypocritical move she made. The county zoning inspector who visited Karen's property was the same Dale who'd cleared my solar panels months earlier. He spent an hour documenting her unpermitted basement modifications, commercial kitchen installation, and separate entrance construction, all violations that carried actual fines, unlike the imaginary rental business she'd accused me of running. Meanwhile, neighbors started quietly sharing information with me. Martha mentioned seeing different cars in Karen's driveway every weekend for 2 years. Frank had noticed Karen collecting cash from strangers who stayed overnight. Even the mailman had commented about multiple packages arriving addressed to lakefront guest services at Karen's address. The community dynamics were shifting in ways Karen hadn't anticipated. Her 2-year intimidation campaign had created underground resistance among residents who were tired of walking on eggshells around her HOA presidency. They'd been afraid to speak up individually, but watching Karen's own violations get exposed was giving them courage to share what they'd observed. That evening, I sat on my dock listening to Karen's basement guests splashing around her illegal hot tub, the sound of their laughter mixing with the gentle lap of waves against legal dock pilings. She'd escalated from harassment to financial warfare, not realizing she'd just handed me ammunition that could shut down her entire operation and potentially cost her the real estate license that funded her McMansion lifestyle. Karen was playing chess while I was learning she'd been cheating at checkers the whole time. Karen's fourth attack came through the building department again, but this time she'd done her homework. Dale the inspector showed up on my doorstep looking genuinely apologetic, holding a clipboard thick with complaint forms and photographs. "Jake, I'm sorry, but but someone's filed a formal complaint about your screened porch addition, claiming it lacks proper permits and violates structural codes. This was my third inspection in 2 months, and I was starting to feel like a criminal in my own home. Dale walked around the porch I'd built with my own hands, checking every beam and joint while I explained for the 100th time that everything was code-compliant and properly permitted. The morning air carried the scent of Karen's designer fabric softener drifting from her laundry room, a cloying reminder that she was probably watching this harassment theater from her kitchen window. What made this attack different was Karen's preparation. She'd provided the building department with professional photographs claiming to show structural modifications and safety violations. Problem was, the photos were manipulated. Angles chosen to make properly installed support beams look inadequate, close-ups that hid the permit stickers clearly visible on my electrical panels. She'd even circled areas in red ink claiming they were unpermitted additions that had actually been part of the original 1940s construction. I was reaching my breaking point. 3 government investigations in 2 months, legal fees mounting, my handyman business suffering because I was spending more time defending my property than working on paying projects. The smell of stress sweat mixing with sawdust in my workshop was becoming too familiar. This is why some people just sell out and move rather than fight these battles. Dale finished his inspection and pulled me aside, lowering his voice like he was sharing state secrets. "Jake, between you and me, this woman tried to bribe me last week. Offered me a free weekend at her lake house if I'd write up violations on your property." His weathered face showed the kind of disgust you see when honest people encounter corruption. "She's been calling weekly about various neighbors, filing complaints, trying to pressure folks into selling. I've never seen harassment this systematic." That's when everything clicked into place. This wasn't personal vendetta. Karen was running a business model. Target elderly lakefront residents with harassment campaigns, file enough government complaints to make their lives miserable, then swoop in through her real estate business to buy their properties below market value. The woman was literally weaponizing government bureaucracy for profit. Dale's revelation explained everything I'd been witnessing. Martha had mentioned Karen pressuring her to sell last year using similar tactics. The Henderson place that sold below market after Karen's architectural compliance campaign. Even Frank had dealt with mysterious permit violation letters after he'd refused Karen's unsolicited purchase offers. She was running a harassment-to-sale pipeline with mathematical precision, probably making $200,000 per property flip. I started documenting everything with the methodical approach my Navy training had drilled into me. Timeline of complaints, copies of all government correspondence, recordings of our interactions, photographs of her trespassing on my property. If Karen wanted to play with government paperwork, I'd show her what military-level documentation looked like. That evening, I was back in the county records office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while I pieced together more of Grandfather's property puzzle. The deeper I dug into 1960s contracts and survey maps, the more interesting things became. There were references to retained marina oversight, subsurface mineral rights, and waterfront structure approvals scattered through dozens of documents. Most of it was buried in legal language that would make a paralegal quit their job, but I was starting to see a pattern. Grandfather had been smarter than anyone realized when he sold lots around Crystal Lake. He'd kept certain rights for himself, rights that apparently transferred to his estate when he died, rights that nobody had exercised in 60 years because nobody understood they existed. I found myself studying a 1962 marina development agreement that made my pulse quicken. Every dock, boat lift, and waterfront structure around the lake required annual permit renewals with something called Original Marina Authority approval. The language was archaic, but the implications were becoming clearer with each document I uncovered. Karen had no idea she'd been harassing someone who might hold regulatory power over her entire waterfront empire. While she was filing false complaints about my screened porch, she was trespassing daily across property where I potentially held legal authority over her dock permits. The irony was building towards something that felt like Grandfather's final chess move, played from beyond the grave. Sitting on my dock that night, listening to Karen's basement Airbnb guests splashing in her unpermitted hot tub, I realized I needed to understand exactly what Grandfather had left me before Karen's next attack. Because if these documents meant what I thought they meant, she'd been playing a game where I held all the winning cards. The breakthrough came when I was least expecting it. I'd been spending so many evenings in the county records office that Lucy, the clerk, started leaving me research notes. Thursday night, buried in a box of 1962 Marina Development files, I found a folder that made my hands stop moving completely. Crystal Lake Marina Development Authority, Esther 1962, was written in grandfather's familiar handwriting across a thick manila folder I'd somehow missed in previous searches. Inside were documents that turned everything I thought I knew about my inheritance upside down. The musty smell of old paper mixed with Lucy's vanilla candle created an atmosphere that felt almost ceremonial as I opened what amounted to grandfather's secret playbook. The documents told an incredible story. When grandfather developed Crystal Lake in the early 1960s, he hadn't just sold lakefront lots, he'd created his own regulatory framework. Every property deed included clauses requiring perpetual approval from original Marina Authority for any waterfront construction, dock modifications, or marine facility installations. He'd essentially made himself the permanent zoning board for anything touching the water, and when he died, I'd inherited that authority without knowing it existed. I sat there in the fluorescent-lit basement, reading legal language that basically said I owned regulatory control over every dock, boat lift, pier, and waterfront structure around Crystal Lake. Karen's dock, her boat lift, her waterfront access, even the HOA's common beach area and boat ramp, all of it operated under permits that required my approval for renewal. The woman who'd been harassing me for months had been living on property rights I could legally revoke with a phone call. But the real bombshell was in a separate file labeled Recent Permit Applications. Karen had been submitting annual renewal requests for her waterfront structures, and every single application was signed Harold Millfield in handwriting that definitely wasn't my grandfather's. She'd been forging his signature for 2 years, authorizing construction and modifications on property she didn't realize he still controlled from the grave. The smoking gun was a dock extension permit from last summer where Karen had signed grandfather's name, dated 6 months after his funeral. She'd literally forged a dead man's signature to authorize her illegal dock expansion into protected spawning areas, the same dock extension that had triggered the environmental investigation she'd tried to pin on me. Pete had mentioned during one of our meetings that forging signatures on government documents was serious business, carrying federal penalties if mail was involved. I found myself laughing in that empty records room, the sound echoing off concrete walls as I realized what had been happening. Karen thought she'd been cleverly covering her tracks with forged approvals, not realizing she was documenting her own felony fraud while harassing the one person who could expose her entire operation. The emotional weight of it hit me like a truck. Grandfather hadn't just left me a cabin. He'd left me the legal tools to protect the entire lake community from exactly the kind of predator Karen had become. Every elderly resident she'd targeted, every harassment campaign she'd run, every below-market sale she'd forced through intimidation. I now had the power to stop all of it and hold her accountable for years of systematic fraud. Driving home that night, Karen's white BMW appeared in my rearview mirror again. She'd started following me around town lately, probably trying to intimidate me into backing down. But as I watched her headlights in my mirror, I realized she had no idea she'd been playing a rigged game where I held all the winning cards. The predator had been stalking someone who could legally destroy everything she'd built through deception. Karen was about to learn that some family legacies come with very sharp teeth. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since leaving the Navy. I called in reinforcements. Pete arrived first, briefcase in hand and that lawyer's gleam in his eye that meant billable hours were about to become very interesting. "Jake, what you've discovered changes everything. We're not just defending against harassment anymore. We're prosecuting organized fraud." Martha showed up 20 minutes later with a plate of cookies and a manila folder thick with documentation. "I've been keeping records of Karen's visits to elderly neighbors," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she was preparing for a long campaign. "Turns out retired teachers are excellent at pattern recognition when it comes to bullies." The smell of oatmeal cookies mixing with lake air through my screen door created an oddly cozy atmosphere for planning what amounted to Karen's legal destruction. Frank arrived last, carrying a notebook that looked like military intelligence reports. His background showed in the organized timeline he'd created of Karen's harassment campaigns around the lake. 8 elderly residents targeted in 2 years, Frank reported, spreading out his documentation like a battle plan. Average time from first complaint to forced sale, 14 months. Average below-market discount, 23%. She's made roughly $400,000 profit from systematic intimidation. He paused, looking up from his notes. "In the military, we'd call this a successful terror campaign." Pete leaned back in his chair, already calculating legal strategies. This isn't just neighbor harassment. It's organized real estate fraud. When agents create market pressure through false complaints while planning to profit from resulting sales, that's federal territory. I remembered him mentioning something similar during our first meeting about conflicts of interest in real estate transactions, but seeing the full scope of Karen's operation made it feel much more sinister. Dale's revelation about Karen's attempted bribery had opened doors to other building inspectors who dealt with her suspicious complaints. She's filed frivolous reports in 3 counties, I explained to the group. Dale says she even tried to hire him as a private HOA inspector to find more violations around the lake. She was literally trying to buy herself a government official. Martha's teacher instincts had kicked into high gear. Most of these elderly residents don't understand their legal protections. They see official complaints and assume they must be guilty of something. Her voice carried the frustration of someone who'd spent decades protecting vulnerable people from predators. We need to educate the community about harassment tactics and documentation. The strategy that emerged was beautifully coordinated. Pete would handle the criminal complaints about forged documents while simultaneously filing with the state real estate board about Karen's conflict of interest violations. Frank would coordinate timing like a military operation, hit her with multiple legal challenges simultaneously so she couldn't respond to one before the next arrived. Martha would organize community education to protect other potential victims. My role was the most satisfying. Formally notify all lakefront property owners about permit requirements under grandfather's marina authority, giving them 30 days to submit proper applications. This would expose every structure operating under Karen's forged approvals, while giving legitimate owners time to comply legally. The beauty of this approach, Pete explained, is that we're not targeting Karen specifically. We're simply enforcing legitimate property laws that have been ignored for decades. She's targeted herself by building her entire operation on forged documents. Frank suggested treating the whole thing like a tactical mission. We coordinate timing so she can't manipulate the narrative or destroy evidence. Criminal charges. Monday, real estate board Tuesday, permit violations Wednesday. Death by 1,000 legal cuts. His military background was showing, but the strategy made perfect sense. The timeline was elegant. Spend 2 weeks gathering final documentation and coordinating with authorities, then execute everything simultaneously at next month's mandatory HOA meeting. Karen had scheduled this meeting to address community security concerns about me, apparently not realizing she'd just arranged the perfect venue for her own public accountability session. Dale volunteered to bring the county environmental inspector who'd discovered Karen's illegal dock extension. Sarah's been waiting for an excuse to nail someone for permit fraud. When she hears about the forged signatures authorizing environmental violations, Karen's going to need more than a good lawyer. That evening I sat on my dock listening to Karen's latest Airbnb guests splashing around her unpermitted hot tub, their voices carrying across water that grandfather had retained rights to 60 years ago. The sound of her designer heels clicking across my dock without permission had become a countdown timer to her own destruction. She'd called an emergency meeting to address the security threat I represented to the community, not knowing she was about to discover exactly how much of a threat someone with legitimate authority could actually become. Karen was about to learn that the difference between real power and imagined power is usually measured in felony charges. Karen's desperation became obvious when Frank spotted professional surveillance equipment pointed at my cabin. "Jake, that's a telephoto lens," he said, handing me his binoculars. "She's hired a private investigator." The metallic click of camera shutters from across the lake mixed with morning birdsong created an oddly sinister soundtrack to my coffee routine. The smear campaign launched on social media within days. Karen started postings in local Facebook groups about the unstable veteran on Crystal Lake who'd been making threats and posed a potential danger to families. She crafted these character assassinations with real estate precision, vague enough to avoid lawsuits, specific enough to plant fear in people who didn't know me personally. The attack hit my livelihood directly. 2 long-term clients called to cancel projects, mumbling about going in different directions after hearing concerning things about my situation. Word travels fast in small towns, and Karen's whisper campaign was poisoning business relationships I'd built through years of honest work. The smell of canceled invoices and lost income filled my home office as I watched my handyman business hemorrhage customers. Here's where Karen's investigation created the mini twist that changed everything. Her PI was thorough enough to discover my inherited marina authority and professional enough to report back honestly. Within 48 hours, Karen knew exactly how precarious her waterfront empire really was. The woman who'd spent months trying to force me off my property suddenly realized I could legally shut down hers. Karen's panic response was immediate and spectacular. She listed her $1 million McMansion for urgent private sale at 15% above market value, hoping to cash out before I discovered the full extent of my powers. But here's the delicious part. Her emergency listing actually confirmed to the entire lake community that she was running scared. Nothing says I'm in deep legal trouble like suddenly needing to sell your dream house in 2 weeks. The bribery attempt came disguised as a neighborly visit. Karen showed up Tuesday evening with expensive wine and a leather portfolio, settling into my porch chair like we were old friends. "Jake, I've been thinking about our situation," she began, all smiles and designer charm. "What if I helped you monetize those old property rights? I could manage the permit process for a small fee, handle all the paperwork hassles." She was essentially offering to pay me to let her continue forging documents. The audacity was breathtaking. When I declined her partnership opportunity, the mask slipped completely. $50,000 cash, Jake, tonight. Just sign over those ridiculous marina rights to the HOA where they belong. The desperation in her voice mixed with the sound of her Airbnb guests laughing in her backyard, creating a perfect soundtrack for someone whose illegal business model was collapsing in real time. "Those rights aren't for sale, Karen," I replied, watching her realize that all her harassment had only strengthened my resolve. "But thanks for confirming you understand exactly what they control." Karen's legal threats escalated to comedy territory. Her lawyer sent cease and desist letters claiming I was causing intentional emotional distress by researching public property records. They threatened lawsuits for tortious interference because I documented her harassment patterns. The woman who'd spent 2 years systematically tormenting elderly residents was now claiming to be the victim of emotional abuse. Pete dismissed her legal bluster with a chuckle. "This is what we call throwing legal spaghetti at the wall," he explained. "She's hoping you'll back down rather than fight multiple frivolous lawsuits." But 20 years in the Navy had taught me to recognize hollow threats from people who confused volume with authority. The community was quietly organizing against Karen's reign of terror. Martha had started a phone tree among harassment victims, sharing information and building solidarity. Frank was documenting the PI surveillance as potential stalking. Even my mailman mentioned that Karen had tried interrogating him about my suspicious packages. Apparently, my legal research materials looked threatening to someone with guilt weighing on her conscience. Karen's final desperate gambit was calling an emergency HOA meeting to address serious security threats from my unstable behavior. The meeting notice claimed I was disrupting community harmony and interfering with legitimate governance. She'd convinced herself that public pressure would force me to back down or disappear entirely. What made this ironic beyond belief was that Karen had just scheduled the perfect venue for her own public destruction. She was planning a community intervention about my threatening behavior while sitting on federal fraud evidence that could land her in prison. The taste of anticipation was sweeter than Martha's cookies as I realized Karen had voluntarily arranged her own accountability session. She'd spent months trying to publicly humiliate me into submission, not realizing she was about to get a masterclass in how real consequences work when you've been playing with forged government documents for 2 years. The countdown to Karen's self-inflicted legal education had officially begun. Karen's final gambit was so desperately theatrical it would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. 3 days before the emergency HOA meeting, she staged a break-in at her own house. I'm talking full production value. Overturned furniture, broken lamp, muddy footprints tracked through her designer kitchen. She called 911 at 2 in the morning, voice trembling with Oscar-worthy terror about how that unstable veteran had finally escalated to home invasion. The fatal flaw in Karen's performance was forgetting about her own paranoid security system. When Officer Martinez arrived, those same cameras she'd installed to spy on neighbors showed absolutely nothing during the alleged break-in. Just Karen's BMW leaving at 10 p.m. and returning at 1:30 a.m., followed by her frantic 911 call 30 minutes later. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with garden center potting soil created a crime scene that fooled exactly nobody. Martinez had the weary patience of someone who'd investigated too many spite reports. "Ma'am, your security footage shows no unauthorized entry," he explained, while Karen invented increasingly creative explanations for why her own cameras had malfunctioned during the exact time of the break-in. The muddy footprints led directly to her garden shed, and her ransacked rooms looked suspiciously organized for someone supposedly searching for valuables. The false report warning was officially documented. But the real destruction was to Karen's remaining credibility. Word spread through the lake community faster than wildfire that their HOA president had been caught red-handed staging fake crimes. Martha called me the next morning, barely containing her amusement. Jake, even Karen's yoga friends are questioning her sanity after the muddy shoe incident. Karen's media strategy backfired with nuclear intensity. She contacted Channel 7 claiming to be a harassment victim in need of community protection, complete with waterworks and dramatic interviews positioned in front of her McMansion. Reporter Jessica Wong was professional enough to ask for supporting evidence and experienced enough to spot inconsistencies in Karen's timeline of alleged threats. When Jessica called for my response, I simply handed over 2 years of documented evidence: government complaints, forged signatures, false reports, systematic elderly targeting. The facts speak for themselves, I said, while Karen's version relied entirely on emotional manipulation and manufactured drama. The contrast between documented harassment and fabricated victimhood was stark enough to make good television. The restraining order hearing became Karen's most spectacular legal miscalculation. She filed emergency paperwork claiming I'd been stalking and intimidating her, presenting Judge Morrison with an impressive timeline of threatening incidents that crumbled under basic scrutiny. Her evidence included me aggressively checking my own mailbox, menacingly gardening my own property, and threateningly sitting on my own dock. Judge Morrison's courtroom smelled like old leather and disappointment as she reviewed Karen's petition with 3 decades of legal experience. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while she examined claims that my presence at the county records office constituted stalking behavior. When the judge's reading glasses slipped down her nose to peer at Karen directly, I knew this wasn't going well for the prosecution. "Ms. Weatherby," Judge Morrison said with judicial precision, "researching public property records is not stalking. It's responsible citizenship." The gavel's bang echoed through the nearly empty courtroom as she denied the restraining order and warned about sanctions for future frivolous filings. Karen left looking like someone had just explained that water flows downhill, while I walked out with official documentation that her harassment claims were legally worthless. The State Real Estate Board investigation was gaining momentum with military efficiency. Frank's documentation of Karen's harassment-to-sale pattern across 8 properties had caught investigators' attention as potential organized fraud. Martha's detailed complaint about systematic elderly targeting was being treated as evidence of predatory business practices that violated multiple state regulations. Karen's illegal Airbnb empire was collapsing under multi-agency scrutiny. County zoning discovered unpermitted commercial modifications. Health Department found unlicensed food service. Fire Marshal identified basement safety violations. Her precious 5-star rating was nosediving as guests realized their luxury lakefront experience was actually participating in an active criminal investigation. The emergency HOA meeting she'd scheduled was approaching with the electric anticipation of a public reckoning. Karen had spent weeks building her narrative about the security threat I posed to community safety, apparently forgetting that her audience would include every elderly resident she'd systematically tormented over the past 2 years. She'd wanted a public platform to destroy my reputation and pressure me into disappearing from Crystal Lake forever. Instead, she'd accidentally scheduled her own trial before a jury of her victims, with evidence of federal fraud as the main exhibit, and local media providing live coverage of her downfall. Karen was about to discover that when you spend years cosplaying as the victim while actually being the predator, reality has a way of demanding its own dramatic finale. The Crystal Lake Community Center buzzed with tension thick enough to cut with a knife. 43 residents had crammed into a space designed for 20, with Jessica Wong from Channel 7 positioning cameras while Officer Martinez lingered near the back door. The smell of Martha's stress-baked cookies mixed with anticipation and Karen's increasingly desperate perfume as she shuffled through notes at the front table like a prosecutor who'd just realized her star witness was imaginary. Karen launched into her prepared presentation with the confidence of someone who still believed she controlled the narrative. "We're here tonight because one individual has created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that threatens everything we've built as a community," she began, gesturing toward me like I was Exhibit A in a murder trial. "Jake Millfield's erratic behavior and threatening presence have turned our peaceful lakefront neighborhood into a place where families don't feel safe." Her evidence was impressively creative. Photos of my cabin taken from her boat, timestamps documenting my suspicious activities, like checking mail at 8 a.m. and mowing grass on Saturday mornings, even testimonials from concerned residents who remained mysteriously anonymous. She'd turned basic property maintenance into a catalog of threatening behavior that would have been hilarious if people weren't actually nodding along. Property values are already declining due to his presence, Karen continued, warming to her theme. Real estate professionals have documented market impacts from unstable residents who refuse to maintain community standards. The audacity of Karen lecturing about property values while running an illegal basement hotel was breathtaking, but about half the room was buying her performance. When she opened the floor for community input about this security situation, Karen actually smiled like she'd just delivered a closing argument that would exile me permanently. She was expecting unanimous support for whatever punishment she had planned. Instead, I stood up and asked to borrow her projector. "Thank you for that presentation, Karen," I said, connecting my laptop while she looked puzzled about why I wasn't slinking away in shame. "I'd like to share some information that might provide helpful context for tonight's discussion." The first document that filled the screen was grandfather's 1962 Marina Development Authority. My grandfather didn't just sell lakefront lots when he developed Crystal Lake, I explained to the suddenly silent room. He retained regulatory oversight of all waterfront structures. When he died 3 years ago, I inherited that authority, which means I have legal control over every dock, boat lift, and marine facility around this lake. The transformation in Karen's expression was visible from space. Confidence melted into confusion, then dawning horror as she realized the implications. Several residents leaned forward, suddenly very interested in 60-year-old property law they'd never known existed. "That includes Karen's dock, her boat lift, and her waterfront access," I continued, advancing to the next slide, "all of which require my annual approval to remain legal." The sharp intake of breath from the audience was audible, but Karen's face going ash white was the real show. The smoking gun appeared on screen next. Karen's permit applications from the past 2 years, each one signed Harold Millfield in handwriting that clearly wasn't my grandfather's. "These are federal documents that Karen has been forging with my deceased grandfather's signature. That's not a paperwork error, that's felony fraud." Karen exploded from her chair like someone had set it on fire. "You can't prove, that's not how the previous owner said." Her desperate stammering was captured in real time by Jessica Wong's camera, while the room erupted in shocked murmurs. Pete materialized beside me with prosecutorial calm. "Criminal complaints have been filed with county and federal authorities regarding forged government documents. Additionally, evidence of systematic harassment designed to manipulate property sales has been submitted to the State Real Estate Licensing Board." That's when the dam burst. Martha stood up. "She used identical tactics trying to force me to sell." Frank added, 17 separate complaints against the Hendersons before they gave up and moved. Other voices joined the chorus as residents finally connected the pattern they'd been living under for 2 years. Karen tried desperately to regain control. "This is character assassination. Jake's the one who's been terrorizing this community." But her voice disappeared into the growing storm of residents sharing their own harassment stories, each account building on the last until the room was buzzing with righteous anger. Officer Martinez stepped forward as Karen looked frantically around the room for allies who were no longer there. "Ma'am, given the active criminal investigations, you might want to exercise your right to remain silent," he suggested with professional courtesy that barely masked his disgust. Karen stumbled toward the exit, her designer heels clicking desperately across linoleum, while 43 pairs of eyes watched her retreat. The woman who'd terrorized elderly residents with bureaucratic weapons had just been publicly exposed as a fraud, a bully, and a criminal. As she reached the door, I delivered the line I'd been saving. "Oh, and Karen? Every time you've walked across my dock without permission, you've been trespassing on property you'll never control." Karen's white BMW disappeared from Crystal Lake within 48 hours, followed by a moving truck that worked through the night like she was fleeing a crime scene, which technically she was. Her McMansion hit the market as a distressed sale, priced 30% below what she'd paid. The kind of poetic justice that made Martha actually giggle over our morning coffee conversations on my dock. The legal consequences unfolded with beautiful precision. County prosecutors filed felony document fraud charges, while federal authorities pursued mail fraud since Karen had submitted forged permits through Postal Service. She pleaded guilty to avoid trial, accepting 5 years probation, $75,000 in fines, and permanent loss of her real estate license. The woman who'd made $400,000 harassing elderly residents into below-market sales was now legally banned from selling property anywhere in Minnesota. But watching our community heal was the real victory. 2 weeks after Karen's exodus, I threw a lakeside barbecue that drew every resident around Crystal Lake. The smell of grilled burgers mixing with pine air and genuine laughter created something we hadn't experienced in years. Actual neighborly joy instead of fearful whispers behind curtains. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking and healing simultaneously. Martha revealed Karen had visited her 6 times last year. Each conversation focused on declining neighborhood conditions and smart exit strategies before values crashed. Frank shared how she'd filed complaints about his flagpole, mailbox, even his choice of lawn fertilizer. Mrs. Patterson, the gentle widow from North Shore, tearfully described how Karen's constant architectural compliance reviews had made her consider assisted living just to escape the criticism. "I thought I was losing my mind," Mrs. Patterson admitted while we watched kids splash safely in the lake. "She made me question every decision, every plant I chose, every improvement I made. I started believing I really was ruining the neighborhood." Hearing that sweet woman blame herself for Karen's psychological warfare reminded me why fighting back had been so important. The permit system I established became everything Karen's reign wasn't: transparent, fair, focused on protecting the lake rather than generating harassment opportunities. Simple applications, reasonable timelines, clear environmental criteria. Within a month, every legitimate waterfront structure was properly documented and legally compliant, without a single harassment campaign required. Property values soared once Karen's market manipulation stopped. The Henderson place sold for 15% above her original asking price to a retired couple from Duluth who were thrilled to find such a peaceful lake community. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that removing the person obsessed with property values had actually improved them. Frank led our new HOA with military efficiency and democratic principles that were revolutionary after Karen's dictatorship. Martha became secretary, organizing community events and elderly resident advocacy. Their first act was establishing monthly property rights workshops, where I taught deed research, legal protections, and harassment documentation, ensuring no future Karen could exploit ignorance about property law. The Crystal Lake Conservation Initiative became grandfather's true legacy. Using permit fees and community donations, we funded native plant restoration, fish habitat improvement, and water quality monitoring. The same dock Karen had tried to weaponize against me became the launch point for educational canoe tours teaching kids about watershed protection and community stewardship. 3 months later, Dale brought his family for Sunday dinner at the community center. "I haven't received a single harassment complaint from Crystal Lake since she left," he marveled, watching his kids chase fireflies while adults shared dessert and stories. 2 years of weekly calls, then complete silence. The transformation was so dramatic that new residents couldn't believe the horror stories longtime neighbors shared about life under Karen's regime. 6 months later, I received a letter from the Hendersons in Arizona thanking me for exposing the harassment that had driven them away. "We thought we were the problem," they wrote. "Knowing it was her vindicated everything we suffered through." Tonight, sitting on this dock, listening to loons call across water, grandfather protected for 60 years, I'm reminded that sometimes the best revenge is letting bullies destroy themselves with their own arrogance. Karen called the cops on my cabin, never knowing I owned the foundation her empire was built on. Got your own HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments. The wildest ones become episodes on Karen stories. And smash that subscribe button because next week I'm sharing how the neighbor who claimed my driveway learned property law through a very expensive education. Trust me, the entitled audacity will blow your mind.